Well, that's, I mean, as far as tourism goes, requires the ability to get to these places, obviously.
Yes.
And here in Atlanta, we like to, some like to say that we're a gateway to Africa because Delta has the flight to Dakar, Senegal,
Sure.
which transfers to Johannesburg and
Sure.
things like that. What do you think about Atlanta as a gateway to Africa?
First of all, I think that, you know, Delta taking that initiative to provide that kind of access to the continent is right on time and right on target. And given the extent to which Atlanta is increasingly becoming a global city, you know, the airport's one of the busiest in the world. You know, you've got your own version of Hollywood down here with folks like Tyler Perry, you know, Coca-Cola, of course, one of the great consumer companies of all time. So Atlanta in its economy, its talent, you know, has the heft to really be a point of entree to the rest of the world. And given that we've got folks like the former UN Ambassador and Mayor Andrew Young, who are here, who know the continent, I'm hopeful, you know, that you'll see much more stuff happen between the United States and African countries, and that Atlanta will play an increasingly important role in those things happening.
Talk about Ambassador Young's role as far as creating relations and awareness between Africa and Atlanta.
Well, I think going back to the era with the Jimmy Carter as president, they had a lot to do with getting Africa higher on the U.S. Radar screen. And quite frankly, though, you know, it's regrettable the way things have turned in Zimbabwe under Mugabe. It's not always been that bad. And the transition, which was relatively peaceful, even though there was an armed component to that struggle, was driven to a great extent by the policies of the Carter administration, which were prompted by then Ambassador Andrew Young.
And some have criticized him now for his support for Mugabe in the past, but you're saying it hasn't always been like that.
Well, it hasn't always been like that. I mean, again, I first went to Zimbabwe in 1982. Which was 2 years after independence, and as a matter of fact, the capital city was still called Salisbury at the time, and there was almost one-to-one parity between the Zimbabwe dollar and the U.S. dollar. The country was the breadbasket for the region, and you know, now it's a basket case. So that's unfortunate, but it does have the kind of infrastructure, both in terms of financial as well as physical infrastructure, that should this power sharing agreement, which was just signed, if it continues to hold, I'm sure we'll see investors go back into Zimbabwe.
And some, I mean, obviously these issues have to do with the things that are in your book. These are mostly leadership issues. Yeah. And you say in the book that the term Africa and the term leadership are not mutually exclusive. And talk about the challenges that the leaders of this new generation, that you call it, this new paradigm, will have to face.
Well, I mean, to say it in summary fashion, you know, for those leaders that led their countries from colonialism to independence, the question was pretty straightforward and simple. How do we get our countries back? For the present generation of leaders, you know, now that the continent is free from Cairo to Cape Town, the question is a different question. And it's simply this: now that we've got our countries back, how do we make them work? And that has at least two components. One, how do we deliver the goods in terms of governance so that people broadly feel like they're stakeholders in the political process? That's one element. The other is economic. And that is, how do we now consolidate the political gains in an economic fashion so that people at the grassroots level up are able to have a new set of opportunities so that they can fulfill their potential and as well help to fulfill the enormous potential of these countries on the continent.
And it seems like there needs to be some sort of understanding on the American side about the fact that, you know, Mugabe is not the operating paradigm necessarily in all the countries. You may see him as a leader of an African nation, and then see the unrest in Kenya that was associated with the presidential elections, and see some of the things that go on in Nigeria, and think maybe there's not any opportunity. But understanding is key. Now, Georgia has an initiative to start teaching about Africa in middle school. I was wondering what your take is as a leader of an Africa Institute, the state of Africa education in the U.S. and how that can be developed.
Well, two things. One, I think it's great that Georgia's taken this initiative, and I think from a pedagogical perspective, so that the educational experience of young people in this state are rounded out in totality. I mean, you can't act as if the largest landmass on the planet doesn't exist. Right. So, I mean, for that reason, I think it's important. Secondly, if we appreciate, we've got two candidates running for president, both of whom have said that the challenge going forward is to decrease our dependence on Middle Eastern oil and on oil coming out of Venezuela. Well, I don't have to tell folks in Atlanta that having enough oil, i.e. gasoline, is a problem. So it means if we're going to decrease our dependence on the Middle East, we're going to have to increase our dependence somewhere else, and that somewhere else is Africa. So we need to understand that continent better, if for no other reason, so that we don't make the same mistakes in Africa today that we made in the Middle East 100 years ago, which have created the problems that we now have in the Middle East. You know, the final point that I would make is that we do need to come up with new models for teaching about Africa. I'm actually working on another book, and the way I describe the approaches to Africa now is that you've got the Afro-pessimist, who believe in a nutshell that Africa's headed to hell in a handbasket. Then you have what I call an Afro-sophist, people like Jeffrey Sachs, who are very well-meaning, but their arguments have so many contradictions within them that it's hard for people to understand. Well, you say we ought to be optimistic, but all the evidence you give points to some real problems. And then what I call Afro-apologists, who want to excuse everything and blame all of the continent's problems on everybody else. And I think that what we have to do is what I call apply a historical critical method, where we really look behind the stories that have already been told, work our way through the mythology about Africa, because much of the stuff that's been written, particularly historically, has been written in a way to justify its exploitation under colonialism, under the slave trade, and to justify interventions during the Cold War, the constructive engagement that Reagan tried to sell us relative to South Africa. So we've got to de-link from that kind of perspective. And so it's good to see, this stuff happening, at this stage. First of all, just geography is a great place to start. It's good to know where the continent is, and it's good to know that Africa is a continent and not a country.
Right, and there are 54 different countries within that continent.
That's right, 53.
That have their own set of nuances.
That's right.